Alone? In house? Mark scoffed. No way. The old house stood on a hill overlooking the town. Locals whispered tales of it being haunted, a place of shadows and screams. Mark, despite his bravado, felt a shiver crawl up his spine just looking at it. Chicken? Jimmy grinned, knowing he'd hooked Mark. Spend one night there alone. Prove it's all just stories. The dare hung in the air, heavier than the gathering dusk. Mark, fueled by youthful arrogance and a desire to impress, found himself accepting. He would regret it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of blood orange and bruised purple, Mark found himself at the foot of the hill. Each step towards the house felt heavier than the last. The house loomed larger with every stride, its silhouette a jagged scar against the dying light. A cold wind whispered through the overgrown garden, rustling dead leaves like brittle bones. The old iron gate creaked open with a groan that seemed to echo Mark's own unease. He swallowed, his mouth suddenly dry, heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. He told himself it was just an old house, neglected and decaying, but deep down, a primal fear stirred. The stories he'd dismissed as folklore suddenly felt chillingly real. The air inside was stale and cold, thick with the smell of dust and decay. Cobwebs clung to every surface like ghostly shrouds, and the only light came from the sliver of moon shining through grimy windows. Mark fumbled for his flashlight, his hand shaking as he flicked it on. The beam cut through the oppressive darkness, revealing glimpses of a once grand home now fallen into disrepair. Faded grandeur clung to the tattered velvet curtains and the dusty chandelier that hung precariously from the ceiling. The air was heavy with silence, a silence so profound it felt like a living presence. He moved cautiously through the house, each creaking floorboard and rustling curtain sending shivers down his spine. The shadows seemed to dance and twist at the edge of his flashlight beam, taking on sinister shapes that sent his heart racing. He tried to rationalize his fear, telling himself it was just the wind, just his imagination. But the house felt alive, pulsating with an unseen energy that sent goosebumps prickling across his skin. The silence, oppressive and heavy, was suddenly shattered by a sound, a soft thud from upstairs. Mark froze, his blood turning to ice in his veins. He strained to listen, his every sense on high alert. Silence again, thick and heavy, then another sound. This time a dragging noise, slow and deliberate like footsteps across a wooden floor. Mark's breath caught in his throat. He told himself it was just the house settling, but his mind conjured images of unseen beings lurking in the shadows. He shone his flashlight up the stairs, the beam trembling in his grip. The staircase spiraled upwards into darkness, the shadows deepening as if trying to swallow the light. He took a hesitant step back, suddenly desperate to be anywhere but here. He considered leaving, running back down the hill, and never looking back. But the dare, Jimmy's mocking face, held him captive. He had to see this through, had to prove he wasn't afraid. The temperature dropped, a sudden chill that seemed to seep into Mark's very bones. He pulled his jacket tighter around himself, his breath misting in the cold air. He shone his flashlight around the room, but there was nothing to explain the sudden change in temperature. And then, he felt it. A presence, something unseen watching him, its cold gaze boring into the back of his neck. He spun around, heart pounding, but found nothing. Yet the feeling lingered, heavy and oppressive, like an unseen entity had entered the room. A book on a nearby shelf, untouched moments before, suddenly slammed shut. The sound echoed through the silent house like a gunshot. Mark jumped, a cry escaping his lips before he could stop it. He stared at the book, his mind struggling to comprehend what he'd just witnessed. He was no longer alone in the house. He was certain of it. Something was here with him, something unseen and malevolent, toying with him, reveling in his fear. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at the edges of Mark's composure. His breathing turned shallow and rapid, his chest constricting with every terrified inhale. His legs felt heavy, rooted to the spot as if the house itself held him captive. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers trembling so badly he could barely dial. The house seemed to close in around him, the darkness pressing down, suffocating him with its palpable terror. The shadows seemed to writhe and twist, stretching out from the corners of the room like grasping claws. They whispered his name, their voices a chorus of chilling whispers that sent shivers down his spine. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the sights and sounds that assaulted his sanity. A cold breath caressed his cheek, sending a wave of goosebumps erupting across his skin. He flinched away, his heart hammering against his ribs. When he opened his eyes, he could have sworn he saw a figure standing at the edge of his vision. A fleeting glimpse of something dark and ethereal. The air grew colder, the stench of decay intensifying, making his stomach churn. He felt a presence behind him, close enough to touch, and he knew with chilling certainty that he was no longer alone in the house. He was surrounded. He scrambled back, his hands scraping against the rough wooden floor, desperate to put distance between himself and whatever lurked in the shadows. But the presence followed, its movements silent and swift, its unseen eyes boring into him, feeding on his terror. Panic surged through him, a tidal wave of fear that threatened to drown him. He scrambled to his feet, his legs shaky, and ran blindly through the house, desperate to escape the unseen horrors that pursued him. But the house seemed to twist and turn, the hallways stretching endlessly before him. He slammed against walls, tripped over unseen objects, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The shadows danced before him, taunting him, herding him deeper into the heart of the house, further from any hope of escape. He cried out for help, his voice echoing through the empty halls, but the only response was the sound of his own terror bouncing back at him. He was trapped, alone in a nightmare, hunted by entities he couldn't see, couldn't fight. He stumbled into a room, slamming the door shut behind him, his back pressed against the cold wood, his chest heaving. He fumbled for the lock, but there was none. He was trapped, at the mercy of whatever lurked beyond the door. The door creaked open, slowly, deliberately, as if whatever was on the other side savored his terror. Mark squeezed his eyes shut, bracing himself for the inevitable. He couldn't run, couldn't hide. All he could do was face the darkness that awaited him. A cold wind swept into the room, carrying with it the scent of decay and the sound of whispered voices. Mark opened his eyes, his breath catching in his throat. Standing in the doorway, bathed in the pale moonlight streaming through the window, was a figure. It was tall and gaunt, its clothes tattered and faded, its skin stretched taut over bones. Its eyes, two glowing embers in the darkness, stared at him with an intensity that sent chills down his spine. Mark stared back, paralyzed with fear, unable to tear his gaze away from the apparition. The figure took a step forward, its movements fluid and silent, like a predator stalking its prey. Mark felt a wave of terror wash over him, so powerful it threatened to overwhelm him. He was going to die here, alone in this cursed house. The figure stopped before him, its glowing eyes boring into his soul. Mark braced himself for the final blow, but it never came. Instead, the figure spoke, its voice a low, raspy whisper that seemed to slither around the room. "You are not meant to be here," it hissed, its breath cold against Mark's cheek. "This house, it remembers, it hungers." Mark stared at the apparition, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing, what he was hearing. This wasn't possible. Ghosts weren't real, and yet here he was, face to face with something that defied all logic and reason. The figure reached out a skeletal hand, its touch sending a jolt of icy fear through Mark's body. "Leave this place," it whispered, its voice filled with a strange urgency. "And never, ever return." And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, dissolving into the shadows like a wisp of smoke. The room was plunged back into darkness. The only sound, Mark's own ragged breathing. He was alone again, but the terror lingered, etched into his very being. Mark didn't wait for morning. He fled the house, racing through the darkness, his lungs burning, his heart pounding against his ribs like a drum. He didn't stop running until he reached the outskirts of town, the first faint glow of dawn painting the sky a pale gray. He never spoke of what he saw that night, not to Jimmy, not to anyone. The memory of the haunted house, of the ghostly figure and its chilling warning remained with him, a constant shadow lurking at the edge of his thoughts. He never went near the house again, but sometimes in the dead of night he could swear he felt a cold presence watching him, its glowing eyes boring into his soul. He knew then that some things could never be outrun, that some horrors lingered long after the encounter, forever haunting the darkest corners of the mind.